Welcome everybody to the 5th annual Pluribus Unum's Truth, Action, and Reconciliation Conversation Series. We're so grateful that you've chosen to spend the next hour with us. When we formulated the idea for these panels, we wanted to add voices to Americans calling to account our country's values and the systems that reflect them. And to respond to that call, we knew that we must start with telling the true story of our country's role in creating inequitable systems that persist today. Our topic this week is democracy. The promise of America to her people is that we all are seated at the table of democracy as equals. Now, while that sentiment is good, we have never fully lived up to this ideal. Systems have been designed and redesigned throughout our history to disenfranchise women, people of color, and Black voters in particular. So today, we're going to take a deep dive. We'll take a historical look at the choices that have put our democracy in crisis, from the census to voting rights. And in that regard, I am honored to introduce our panel. They're both are named MARC, and they're both brilliant and know more about this than anybody else in the country. The first is my very dear childhood friend, MORIAL, who is currently the president and CEO of the National Urban League. He's the former mayor of the city of New Orleans, and a great one at that, and the former president of the United States Conference of Mayors. MARC also serves on EPU's National Advisory Council. MARC, welcome. The second MARC is ELIAS, who is the chair of the Perkins Coie Political Law Group and is the publisher of Democracy Docket, a new tool to fight against voter suppression and handling more voter rights cases than anybody else in the country as we speak. So I'm so happy to welcome you both to this conversation. So let's get started. Mayor MORIAL, you know, everybody knows you as a great mayor and as the president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors and now the Urban League. But what they don't know about you, and they should, besides being a great civil rights lawyer, is that you are a pretty good armchair historian. So with that in mind, let me kind of throw this at you, and then Mark Elias, you can follow up. From the framing of the Constitution, as it was, to the 14th, 15th, and 16th Amendments, to the Electoral College, to the 3/5 Compromise, our history shows that the right to participate in our democracy has not been open and honest, forthright, or one that is given to all. With that in mind, I want you to talk to us a little bit about the full history of lack of access to the ballot and to vote, and the right to participate in our democracy from a little bit of a historical lens, especially with a view from the South.
Let me, first of all, I want to thank you, Mayor Mitch LANDRIEU, my good friend and outstanding leader for New Orleans, and also a soldier in the fight for justice. Your commitment to Pluribus Unum and bringing people together to make this your life's work is admirable and just so refreshing. And I want to thank you for that. Mark Elias, who is one of the nation's foremost voting rights lawyers and has brought many important cases over the years. It's an honor to be with you and to share this discussion with you. 1776, 1787, 1789, the founding years of the Republic, the Declaration of Independence, of course, leading first from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitutional Convention. The important thing for Americans of this generation to believe is that there was never any intention for voting and the franchise to be universal and available to all. The mindset at that time was that it belonged to the favored few, white men of privilege and white men of property. And it was so ensconced in the in the founding principles of the nation that the founding fathers made all sorts of political trade-offs which marginalized the value of Black people, but also created political advantages to slaveholding states. Slaveholding states got an opportunity to include in their population base, for the purposes of the number of seats in Congress, all Black people, but count each Black person as 3/5 of a person, which meant for every basically 15 white people, you got what, almost 10 black people added, but those black people were not able to vote or participate in the franchise. It was a political compromise, naked and through, and it was born of the white Southerners from places like Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, the slaveholding states, which included Maryland and Delaware at the time, who did not want to be, if you will, outvoted. They were fearful of the abolition of slavery in the new republic because there were founding fathers in Philadelphia in 1787, Ben Franklin for one, who were abolitionists and who were opposed to slavery, but they were not willing to throw down a gauntlet to, if you will, say, if slavery is part of the new land, I won't be part of the new land. So from that period of time, voting was for white men of privilege and power. Now, one thing we don't often talk about is that in those days, only 10% of the people were literate. Most people could not read, they could not write, they made their living using their hands and their bodies, but those that read and those that wrote and those that were educated were truly in great power. And so the Jeffersons and the Washingtons and the Madisons and the Monroes and the Adamses and all of the great, the founding fathers of this country were very learned men, but also much, much, much more learned than the average person at that time. We know that coming forward, the country fought a war in the 1860s. Central to Lincoln's vision post the war were necessary changes in the framing document or the founding document, meaning the Constitution. So 3 amendments were added. The 13th Amendment, which banned slavery. The 14th Amendment, which guaranteed citizenship to Black people and guaranteed citizenship to those born on American soil, and a provision that guaranteed all citizens the equal protection of the laws. And then finally, the 15th Amendment, which simply said that no state on the account of race could deny, because voting was considered to be regulated by the states, the right to vote. A giant leap forward from slavery and servitude to full citizenship with the right to vote. And Blacks began to vote and participate in politics. Indeed, our home state, Louisiana, had 2 Black lieutenant governors in the 1870s, a Black governor, PBS Pinchback, in the 1880s. There were 22 African-American members of Congress in the 1880s. And the Black codes began. Notwithstanding the Constitution, Southern states, Southern cities began passing laws, including laws that were designed to deny newly freed slaves from the right to vote. The literacy test, the poll tax, the grandfather clause, were all designed to undercut, if you will, the gains made in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Mind you, something began in the 1850s that culminated in the 1920s, and that was the movement for women's suffrage, which was a movement that began in the 1850s and continued all the way to the 1920s. So in many respects, the late 1800s, the hallmark of the late 1800s was effort to smash, crush, deny, thwart the right to vote that had been won by African Americans, by Black people as a result of the Civil War. I like to look at the 20th century as a century where there was a broad movement for the expansion of democracy in stages. The passage of the amendment to the Constitution in 1920, which gave women the right to vote, was after many, 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 many years of marches and protests. But it was incomplete because it only gave white women the right to vote. Coming forward to the 1960s, the Constitution was amended a number of times, again, to expand democracy. Number one, the poll tax was eliminated and declared unconstitutional by, I believe it was the 24th Amendment. The Constitution was expanded to give 18-year-olds the right to vote. And then Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, which was really designed to ban, eliminate, and thwart all of the efforts that had been taken, that had been made from really the 1860s all the way through and up into the 1960s to thwart African Americans' the right to vote. So it was a fight, it was a battle all along this long, long journey. Why are we where we are today? I believe we're where we are today because in 2013, the Supreme Court, in a decision that I think will rank with Dred Scott and Plessy as a low moment in the history of the Supreme Court, blew a hole in the side of the Voting Rights Act. And as a result of that hole, voter suppression just sprinkled and was injected like poison throughout the American landscape. Voter ID, ending early voting, you name it, and there are so many pernicious ways in which the right to vote is being thwarted. You know, Mayor, it's a short Cliff Note version of this long history of struggle, and the 20th century was marked by repeated efforts to expand the right to vote. Unfortunately, the 21st century, in its first 20 years, is marked by an effort to make it more difficult for people to vote.
Yep.
And it's a sad and sorry legacy that we're all fighting against. Universal franchise. The founding fathers loved the Romans. They loved the French. They loved Montesquieu and the great French philosophers who wrote in glowing terms about the universality of man and human rights. But they never intended it to mean and Black people and women, even if the words included them.
Well, that was excellent. Mark Elias, would you like to add anything to that, what I consider to be a really good sketch of our history?
No, only I think that the mayor, as usual, was spot on, and it's an honor, let me just say, to be sharing a stage with him. He is one of my heroes. I have an affinity, obviously, for the LANDRIEU family, but Mark MORIAL has been one of my heroes, so it's really a tremendous honor to be here today, and I agree with everything he said, other than just to add that the fight was never won. You know, and very oftentimes it's easy for people to say, well, that was then and this is now. And the truth is that in 2019, I was part of a team that litigated a case in Mississippi that challenged a state constitutional provision. And let me just tell you a little bit about it, because I think it's the history of voting rights struggles in America and how unresolved they remain. Because we're not talking about a lawsuit that was brought in the 1950s or the 1960s. This is not something that disappeared in the 1970s or even with President Obama's election in 2008. In 2019, we challenged a provision to the Mississippi state constitution that was put in place in 1890. Whites in Mississippi faced what they viewed as an existential crisis following the 15th Amendment, which was more than 100 African Americans, recently freed slaves, had been elected to the state legislature, including, by the way, 15 to the state Senate. And they had, in fact, elected a state lieutenant governor. Black men at that point arguably constituted a majority of the population. So what did they do? In 1890, Judge Calhoun organized a hasty constitutional convention in Mississippi and changed the way in which they choose statewide elected officials, because they were concerned that a governor, having experienced a lieutenant governor, be elected. They were concerned that that they could eventually be governed by someone who was black. So they instituted a rule that said that in order to win statewide office in Mississippi, it wasn't good enough that you won the popular vote. You also needed to win a majority of the state house districts. Well, of course, they gerrymandered the state house districts to be majority white. They have been majority white ever since. And it was put in place explicitly, not implicitly, not with any cleaned up 2020 language, but explicitly, it was put in the state constitution explicitly as a check to prevent a black person from being elected governor by getting a majority of the vote. It was a way that they would prevent that from happening because they would control the state house. So this provision stayed in effect. In 1896, the Mississippi Supreme Court acknowledged that the reason why this provision was important was to prevent whites from losing control of the state of Mississippi. So by 1896, it had been passed into the state constitution by a racist white population. It had been blessed by the state constitution. And that law has been in effect, and notwithstanding Mississippi having what I believe to be the largest percentage of African Americans in the country, they have never elected a statewide black person to office. And so this law got challenged. I and others brought a challenge to this in 2019. And the court indicated that the law is obviously unconstitutional, gave the state of Mississippi an opportunity to change its constitution, which it is now in the process of doing. But I mention that story not just because it shows you what Mayor MORIAL was saying about the mindset in the 1890s, but the long-term consequences that this had. How many generations of black men and women didn't achieve political power because this constitutional provision was there? And we can't just turn our eyes and say that was then, because this was the last, this was in place for the last governor's race. And we can't say that the times have changed, because yes, we are seeing a regression. I agree with Mayor MORIAL that the beginning of this century has marked a sliding back. But it's important to recognize that we never achieved as much as sometimes I think people think we achieved.
Well, those are, first of all, both of those answers were fantastic. I want to kind of dig down a little bit deeper on this topic, and let me, Mark and Mark, try to frame it up for you. When Jefferson Beauregard Sessions, as a United States Senator and as our Attorney General, said publicly he doesn't believe in institutional racism, the other day, our Attorney General, testifying before Congress, said the same thing. And Senator Tim Cotton, who is a presidential hopeful, said that slavery was a necessary evil. When that language is coming out, and you hear a lot of white people repeating that, saying, I don't understand institutional racism, institutional bias. Help explain clearly, although you just did it historically, how those rules that were in place intentionally and purposefully, I call them you're invited to participate, but you got to do all this other stuff that nobody else has to do before you get what everybody else gets theory of governing. If you think about, just explain the institutional bias and what the consequences it produced. The second thing is people say, well, that was a long time ago. Slavery was way back then. It doesn't have any consequence. There's no sequela from it. There's no consequence from it. And reflect on, especially as we think about the women's suffrage movement and their right to vote, do you believe now that the intersection or connection to this history and the growing force that women of color bring is evidence of the fact that, that when you break down the barriers and you give people opportunity, they do what you would have expected them to do had the barriers not been there. And Mayor MORIAL alluded to this earlier, that I think maybe most people in the public don't understand, that during Reconstruction, when the laws were open and people were given freedom, African Americans actually ascended to fairly significant positions of power in Mississippi, in Louisiana, I think in Alabama as well.
And South
I'd like
Carolina.
to just speak to that just for a minute, if you guys don't mind.
Let me take this. I want to say this about institutional racism, which I hear the questions. One of the reasons why people don't understand institutional racism is because, or they say they don't understand it, is because institutional racism was promoted with what I call a cover story, or otherwise a big lie. That cover story or big lie was the inherent inferiority of Black people. That Black people do not achieve in school, not because they're being discriminated against, but because they're inherently inferior. Black people have not achieved high public office because, after all, they're just not ready or prepared. And I'm talking about the doctrine of supremacy, which supported slavery. It supported segregation. It's the big lie. It's the cover story. After all, you'd be better off and your community would be okay if you had more married nuclear families. You'd be better off and you'd be okay if you just weren't as lazy. You'd be better off and you'd be okay, you know, if you just acted differently. So institutional racism had a cover story which justified and said that the disparity. So what institutional racism is all about, it means that disparities are the natural order. That's what institutional racism. We accept the disparities because we think it's natural. We think it's the way things are meant to be. And that it becomes institutionalized because we don't question it. Or some people don't question it, say, oh, it's just natural. For a long time, could a Black person really be qualified enough to be mayor of New Orleans or mayor of Atlanta? Could a Black person really be qualified enough to sit in the United States Senate or become president of the United States or run Time Warner or American Express? Could a Black person really be qualified enough to be Secretary of State or Attorney General? So the covers people have to understand, when they understand, is that we were taught, let's say people were taught, particularly white Americans were taught, there was an effort to suggest that there was an inherent inferiority in Black people, and that's why they were where they were. That it was their own fault, it was their own doing, it was their own deficiencies. And I think that maybe people can understand that code and that frame continued to justify its continued existence. And I do think, Mitch, that the Pluribus Unum has a great opportunity to better educate people about institutional racism and bigotry. And a person could be a fair-minded person, exist in and benefit from an institutionally racist environment and say, I don't have a bigoted bone in my body. And maybe they don't, right? And we have to understand individual bigotry is not the sum total of racism. You know, the racism is systemic, right? It is systemic. I said to people, suppose we lived in a building where half the people were 8 feet, 10 inches tall. So that meant all the chairs were this high, all the doorknobs were this high. And then you said, it's your fault that you're not tall enough to sit in the chair. It's your fault because you're not tall enough to open the door, right? So institutionally, it was built for the 8 foot, 10 inch person. It's hard to help people understand it, but I like people to understand, you know, the cover story, the way in which it's taught. And, you know, I learned this from growing up in New Orleans and going to school, you know, and I mostly went to school from elementary to middle school to Jesuit High, where I was one of only a few Black students.
We went to school together, you remember.
Yeah, we went together. And you learn you learn, right? People had attitudes, and they sometimes, well, you're different because you're smart. I said, no, 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 no. I think you never really met a lot of Black people before, right? So, you know, maybe your perception is different. So I really think E Pluribus Unum's got a chance to really, and it's gonna, people have to be educated through history. And I want to use one example of institutionalized racism that talks about Social Security. And that is when the Social Security Act was passed, two, if you will, job categories were excluded from Social Security: domestic workers and farmhands, or people that worked in agriculture. Well, where did most African Americans work? Women worked as domestic workers. Black men were working in rural jobs. That's an example of institutional racism. Another example is when the FHA was founded and the government started guaranteeing home loans, and they drew lines around neighborhoods and said, we can't insure any loans here, here, and here. It just so happened to be the African-American neighborhoods, right? And that's another example of how then the mortgage market that's created and the home ownership opportunities that are created exclude African-Americans because of decisions that are being made in an institutional sense.
Call that red line. And so those are both are good points. In the context of voting, Mark, when Mayor MORIAL was talking to us about history, he talked about literacy tests. He talked about intimidation. President Obama the other day in his eulogy for John Lewis reminded us that people were asked to count jelly beans in a jar. All policies. What is the origin of voter registration anyway? And how come voter registration is just not automatic or universal?
Look, I think that the origins of many of these laws, I'm gonna answer your question on voter registration specifically, but let me take a broader lens to something that Mayor MORIAL said. So one of the questions that I get all the time is, but the rules are the same for everybody. But the rules are the same for everybody. So there can't be anything about the voting rules that discriminate against Black voters because it's the rules for everybody. And what I tell them is two things. Number one, in 2013, the legislature in North Carolina set about passing a new set of voting rules that were quote unquote neutral. What it turns out is after we sued, there was a number of lawsuits, I was involved in one of them. It turns out that the Republican legislature, hours after the Shelby County decision came down, embarked on a mission to change their voting laws. And they asked their staff to score the voting laws based on the impact it would have on Black and white voters. So they had a menu. They had a menu of, these are the changes we could make that would negatively impact white voters. These are the changes we could make that would negatively impact Black voters. And they chose the ones that impacted the most Black voters while impacting the fewest white voters, right? Because you could also make changes that negatively impacted or positively impacted everyone, right? So they chose the ones that had the greatest negative impact on Black voters. That was struck down by the Fourth Circuit because they said it targeted African Americans with surgical precision. Now, let me clarify a couple of things about that I have not said. I didn't say it targeted Democrats with surgical precision. I didn't say it targeted progressives with surgical precision. It didn't do any of those things, right? Because there were white Democrats, particularly in North Carolina, and it didn't seek to target them, right? It targeted African Americans with surgical precision. That was the data that they used to draw those lines. Let me give you one more data point. I'm sorry, Mayor LANDRIEU, not to have taken it in this direction, but I think it's important for people to understand. People say, well, vote by mail or absentee voting. You know, that's neutral. These anti-fraud rules we want, they're neutral for everybody. You know, why can't we have these rules that apply to everybody? So I've said this to folks, that if you were to draw up a set of rules that you are trying to help old white people, it is what the absentee voting rules are in most states. Now, whether they were or not drafted for that purpose is a separate question. In many places they were, but it goes to the institutional effect of racism in this. So let's take some data to put some meat on these bones. In 2018, there was a close Senate race and close governor's race in Florida. Bill Nelson lost by 0.1%, Andrew Gillum lost by 0.4%. There was a study that looked at mail voting rejections. These are ballots that were cast that were not counted. In a typical election, you have about 1% of vote by mail ballots that don't count. So some social scientists said, let's look at the composition of that 1% in Florida. Here's what they found. African Americans were disenfranchised at more than twice the rate of whites. So if you just look at the rejected absentee ballot pool, the rejection rates for blacks was twice that of whites. Okay, that would be the, you're going to help me along here, Mayor, that would be the 15th Amendment. Okay? Then there was a study in Georgia that looked at the same thing in Stacey Abrams' election, found the same thing on race, but they looked at gender. Women had a 0.5% higher rejection rate than men. Well, isn't that curious? Right? Why would that be? Right? So that's our next amendment, right? That's the 19th, right? Everyone following along with me?
Yep.
Then they looked at age, 18 to 21-year-olds, 5 times the rejection rates of people over 65. Now, that's not by accident. That is an institutional, or whether it's by accident or not, that is an institutional problem. We have drawn laws that have existed for time and time again that systematically, to use the mayor's word, systematically disenfranchise African Americans, Latinx, there's similar data for Latinx in parts of the Southwest, young voters, and at least in one place, women. So it's one thing for people to say these are neutral rules, but the neutral rules weren't drawn to inconvenience everyone the same. They were drawn to inconvenience some voters more than other voters. And until we accept that there is no neutrality in that system, but these are a series of policy choices, that's where we are.
Well, Mark, I think those are great points. We have about 15 to 20 minutes left, but you take us right to where I wanted to go. MORIAL, in his history lesson, told us that in most of the 20th century, we worked really, really, really hard to extend the franchise, notwithstanding the fact that people in the local areas were pulling it back. But in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, we have now reversed course, and the current administration and others continue to put barriers in place. And these barriers have something to do with gerrymandering. They have something to do with the census. They have something to do with specific guidelines about who gets to vote, how we get to vote, absentee voting, mail-in voting, all of these kinds of things. So just in your view, what are the barriers that are being put up right now that you're fighting, in the courts, and of course the urban leagues fighting as a policy matter, and the barriers that we need to knock down? And then finally explain, if there is any difference, I don't think there is, but people seem to get confused about this, between mail-in voting and absentee voting. And if absentee voting has been so wonderfully accepted, what's wrong with mail-in voting?
Let me take one thing. So if I could design the most perfect system, it would probably be a system which would allow people to show up in a polling place. You'd have to have a verification system, and like you have in some states, and present yourself, show something, and then be able to vote without being registered.
Because the concern is fraud, right?
Yeah, if I had a second most favorite system, it would be a system where you had universal early voting, where there was a 2-week window, let's say, during which people could vote. And that in that 2-week window, there were lots of locations and lots of polling places. The idea is for it to be convenient for people. The idea is for it to be available to people. The idea is for it to be accessible to people so that you don't face lines. If you think about it from an elections administration point of view, early voting makes the work of elections officials more efficient, because they're not trying to if you will, provide for, particularly in large metropolitan areas, large numbers of voters coming to the polling places on a Tuesday election, sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the evening, sometimes at lunchtime, in the windows when they're not working. The third thing I think we have to consider is whether election day should be a holiday or whether we should do as we've done in Louisiana, which is move election day to a Saturday when many people work on Saturday, but more people are off. We've got to deal with, I always said that voter ID was basically unnecessary because there is a verification system at the polling place. It's called signing your name. And the elections commissioner is to, if you will, compare signatures to verify you are who you are. And that's been the long-standing system of verification. And when you add voter ID and you limit voter ID, you're simply erecting an unnecessary barrier in front of people's ability to vote. And so these suppression, it was early voting was created to benefit older white voters, so that they would not have to deal with lines on election day. When African Americans and others began to utilize early voting, particularly weekend early voting and Sunday early voting, that's when you saw the assault on early voting take place in many, many states across the nation. I remember when we were in the legislature, Mitch, Pepe Bruno had bills every year to open the polling places at 8 and close them at 6. You know, every year there was a package, this is in the 80s and 90s, a package of suppression bills. Now, we fought them, we thwarted them, because in those days, the rural legislators were against limiting polling hours, but we also always knew that if in fact they somehow snuck through the legislature, we had the Section 5 provision of the Voting Rights Act through which we could challenge those bills. Today, we don't have that tool in our arsenal, and therefore these legislatures can literally go hog wild,
Right.
passing all sorts of methods to limit voting.
Today, by the way, is the 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act.
Oh, wow.
How about that? So Mark Elias, you know, when you hear Mayor MORIAL talk about this, and the mayor and I were in the state legislature, he in the Senate and I in the legislature, went through different rounds of reapportionment, fighting over whether we're going to apply one person, one vote to a Supreme Court district, dealing with gerrymandering. You know, it seemed to me that it was all part of a concerted effort to limit people's access to the ballot rather than to make it more universal. And I know that that has been your experience. What are the most current battles that you're fighting in court to expand the right to vote? And then both of you, if you can, talk a little bit about the census.
Sure.
As we go forward.
So let me say a word about the current litigation that's going on, and then I can say something about redistricting in the census. I'm very interested in Mayor MORIAL's views on all of that. Right now, we're litigating in 15 states, and in all of those states, we are trying to expand voting rights for everybody. There is no state in which you can say, you know what, MARC is trying to make it harder to vote for this group. We're trying to make it easier to vote for everyone. Today, we filed a lawsuit against Georgia over the horrendous long lines. People don't realize oftentimes that, that when we see long lines, it's not a sign of enthusiasm. It's a sign of a failure of democracy, and that inevitably the faces of those people in line are Black and brown and young. There was a study that used cell phone data to track how long people waited in line, because they could tell how long a particular cell phone pinged off a tower, and they found that African Americans are 30% more, wait in line 30% longer than whites on average. Those are averages. In some places, it's significantly higher. So we're bringing litigation to deal with problems of long lines, to expand in North Carolina, to expand early voting opportunities, precisely for the reasons that Mayor MORIAL pointed out. and to make sure that in the absentee ballot arena, in a number of states, that where there are absentee, where people want to vote by absentee, that we don't face a situation in which Black voters face twice the disenfranchisement of whites, young face five times the disenfranchisement of older, and to try to have a fair process in vote by mail so that we don't see skyrocketing rejection rates. You know, we all have seen what's going on in New York with the large number of absentee ballots that have been rejected. But I want to point to Kentucky, which, you know, a lot of people pointed out was a success in their primary. And in some sense, it was a success. There was high voter turnout. But if you look at the rejected ballots, the rejected ballot rates, I believe this is correct. It was correct as of a few days ago. In Louisville, the rejection rates were 4%, and in Lexington, they were 8%. Those are obviously unacceptably high. And, you know, though I have not seen the underlying demographics, it's pretty predictive as to why they were so much higher in those jurisdictions than in elsewhere. So we're litigating in a number of states to try to deal with these systemic problems so that everyone's ballot has an equal chance of counting. On the census thing, I'll say this. You know, I argued 4 cases in the U.S. Supreme Court in between 2018 and 2019. All 4 were racial gerrymandering cases. In 2 were out of Virginia, where the legislature had put literally a quota of 55%. That's how many African Americans they wanted in each district. In fact, there was an instance where the state legislative district was 54.9%, and they said, no, not good enough. It needs to be 55%. We sued over the congressional map, which had a similar 55% rule. And as a result, we won both of those cases. The legislature flipped to be Democratic, as you know, since then. And Congressman McEachin won his election once Bobby Scott's district was no longer subject to this arbitrary rule. We sued North Carolina, also in the Supreme Court, and won, where the legislature was racially gerrymandering African Americans to decrease their voting strength. So, you know, I think as we go into the census, I'm very worried about what the Trump administration is doing in trying to rush it so that there is an undercount, because that undercount will again disadvantage minority populations relative to others. But as we go into redistricting next cycle, you know, everyone focuses on partisan gerrymandering, and I, you know, I understand the concerns about partisan gerrymandering. I have concerns about excessive partisan gerrymandering, but I think we can't lose sight of the fact that, you know, even when you looked, you know, when the Republicans said in Virginia that they weren't actually targeting Black voters, they were targeting, they were just targeting Democrats. We were able to show in a visual way, and anyone wants to see it, I'm happy to publish it or send it to you. You could literally see in Democratic neighborhoods where there were both Black and white voters, they literally crossed the street. They went down the street and just grabbed the Black households, even within Democratic areas. So, you know, I'm very worried about the census. I'm worried about gerrymandering, but I think we need to continue to be mindful of the negative impact that can happen to African-American voters in particular.
Mark, thank you. MORIAL, I've got a couple of students and questions have asked a couple of questions that I wanted to ask you guys to respond to before we have to get out of here. But one of the guests has said, recent studies have indicated that a majority of eligible voting population are young people and people of color. I think the assumption is that, you know, maybe most of those folks are going to be Democrats. I'm not so sure. So the question is, how do you think this is going to affect political parties in the future, that most of the eligible voting population are younger members now?
I think younger voters in the United States, I think there's studies to this effect. Newer voters, emerging voters, under 40 voters are more likely to be Democrats, more likely to be progressive, more likely to be more liberal, more likely to be more on the left end of the political spectrum. They've been shaped by the Great Recession. They've been shaped by the Iraq and the Afghanistan wars. They've been shaped by income inequality and the racial wealth gap. They're being shaped now by COVID and governmental failures. They've been shaped by their reaction to President Trump as the embodiment of Republican politics. And I do think that one warning is that their high levels of maybe disaffection with traditional voting and traditional politics as a way to improve their own lives. And I think elected officials today are going to have to do a better job to meet these young emerging voters where they are, which is why I think you see, and you saw in the most recent cycle, several incumbent, more, if you will, experienced Democratic members being defeated at the polls by younger, more, if you will, progressive candidates. And I think that may be a trend that could indeed continue. These younger voters, and this election cycle will be a very important to look at, if these younger voters assert themselves at the ballot box and are participants in large numbers, then they will send a powerful message about their ability to impact the electorate and impact American politics going forward. So I think the jury's out, but it's important to understand where they are coming from. There's a segment not necessarily bought into electoral politics as an effective way to change things. But I do think you're going to see a new generation. Look, Mitch, you and I got involved in electoral politics when we were young Turks in our 20s and early 30s, and we were the young Turks. Now we've become the seasoned, well, I ain't gonna say we old, because I'll never, you know, we're coming a seasoned, mature crowd. And, you know, we understood because when we ran in those days, we were running against older guys, and we said it was time for them to move out of the way, that there needed to be new approaches and new energy. And I think that generational shift we're going to see, particularly if young voters assert themselves in the fall elections, in the presidential, in U.S. Senate and congressional elections up and down.
Well, I thank you for that. And I know that we have a lot of young people that feel, you know, that nobody's responding to them. I think the protesters in the street are giving us a new energy and a new focus. Let me just hit you with this last question. It's a 40,000-foot question, but we'll close out with this, with Mark Elias, you going first if you don't mind. But EPU has stated pretty clearly that the country's divided by design. I think you guys have talked about that today, that we are the way we are because the rules were designed that way. We've also said that we think people have to understand the truth. And I want to ask you to consider what you think the most important truth regarding our democracy is what we have to acknowledge and then reckon with if we're going to get to the other side of this thing.
So I think two things. The first is I worry a lot that people don't understand that democracy is based not just on rules, but on norms and how we treat each other. And, you know, part of the strength of people sometimes refer to a country as a liberal democracy, not liberal as in progressive, but valuing certain ideals. And I feel, you know, liberal democracies thrive on a striving to be better. And I think that there is a large segment of the country that has lost the ethos to try to be better than we were before. It's, you know, that there is a nostalgia for the way we were rather than, you know, the way we can be. So I think that that's one thing. The second is that I think we have to recognize that with voting, the rules matter, and that that these are not neutral principles. And that you know, just as the deck was stacked against African Americans in the labor force, the Social Security example is like phenomenal. I mean, that's like a great way to think about it. But that in the voting process and in democracy, whether it's gerrymandering or what the state of Mississippi was doing, these rules have been in place and they have had long-term consequences that have affected who runs for office, who gets elected, how decisions are made, and how future decisions around elections are made. And we need to be honest about that. So that's mine.
Thank you. MORIAL?
I would say people have to understand where the country is going. The country is becoming multicultural, multi-religious. multi-ethnic, multi-orientation. And if we are not successful in leveling off the economic playing field, if we are not successful in creating both political and economic systems that people have confidence in because they feel like they have a seat at the table, this country is going to pay a very, very steep price. People have to grapple with, understand, and embrace that the 21st century is not the 20th century. Just as people recognize that the 20th century was not the 19th century. And the norms and the attitudes that may have propelled the 20th century are not going to necessarily work in the 21st century. As a multicultural democracy, we have to be united by, MARC called it norms. I called it values, principles, aspirations, and aims. We're not going to be united by religion. We're not going to be united by ethnicity. We're not going to be united by a single set of maybe cultural values. That's the uniqueness of the United States. In that uniqueness is its beauty, and in that uniqueness is its risk. Its risk as to whether it can truly become this multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multi-religious democracy. But we've got work to do. The second thing I would say, everyone should pay very close attention, policymakers, at how much ground we have lost since the year 2000. Now here we are, in less than 20 years, we're going through our third recession, our third significant economic downturn. The first one was after 9/11. It was temporary, but it was an economic downturn. It required stimulus spending. It required interventions. The second one was the Great Recession that took place beginning in late 2008. The third one is this COVID-induced, Trump recession, which is affecting us today. Three, if you go back to the 20th century, and look at the recessions, we had multiple mild recessions, but we've had this deep, deep challenge, not to mention the assault on voting, not to mention the rise in hate crimes, not to mention the surge in gun violence, not to mention the spate of police brutality. I fear, we begin to look at these challenges, school killings, police brutality, as normal. And so we just got to tolerate it, and not as abnormal, and we have to fix it.
Mayor, thank you so much. Mark, Elias, thank you so much both for being here. Very insightful,
Mayor
very
Landrieu,
informative,
thank you,
very helpful. And I want to just tell the folks that are listening how much I appreciate you joining us. This concludes the fifth part of our Truth series of EPU's Truth, Action, and Reconciliation conversations. Starting in September, we're going to begin the Action series to discuss what is happening right now that can lead our country and our communities into a more equitable future. I hope you will join us then. Watch for more information very soon. Thank you again for being with us today, and have a great weekend.